Welcome, and thank you for coming to this evening's screening and discussion of Daughters of the Dust. And I'm so happy you're able to join us for this event tonight, the second screening in our program, Cinematic Afterlives, Film and Memory in the Black Atlantic. Cinematic Afterlives is a film series aimed at fostering discussions in GUQ and the larger education city community about the way we narrate, represent, and engage the past through film. I'm so pleased to see that some of you here have returned from our first screening 2 weeks ago when we discussed Tomás Gutiérrez Alea's La Última Cena. Now, last time I opened the screening with a series of questions about the way film could mediate the relationship between history and the political future. While Gutiérrez Alea's film offered many entry points into this discussion, our audience members raised a really important question. How is the relationship between past and present, between memories of slavery and aspirations of freedom, gendered? What new themes would attending to women's experiences and their place in the family attune us to? Julie Dash's 1991 film, Daughters of the Dust, can be viewed as a Black feminist response to these questions, one that centers, as Black studies scholar and geographer Catherine McKittrick has described, Black livingness, as the members of the Pesant family, and especially the women in the family, contend with what it means to thrive in the decades after the end of slavery. The particular character of their debates are grounded in the film's setting at the turn of the 20th century, but they nonetheless resonate to the viewer across into the present and across diasporas. Keep in mind the centrality of memory to this intergenerational story narrated by a child yet to be born. One more thing to keep in mind as you watch: as an environmental historian, I'm really struck by the way that the film represents place and how the landscape figures into the story, creating what scholars, including McKittrick as well as J.T. Rohn, call Black ecologies. If our relationship to the land, and here the sea is part of what makes us who we are, this relationship is always powerfully gendered. But we should also ask how this relationship is experienced in post-slavery and post-colonial landscapes, as well as in diaspora communities. For those in the audience studying places beyond the Atlantic worlds, these methodological moves might prove particularly interesting. And indeed, they are particularly evocative of the ecologies of the Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism, articulated by scholars like Mazen Kounsaya and others, a connection which might provide many interesting points of departure for discussion this evening. Now, to guide us tonight, we are privileged to have as our discussant Professor Dana Olwan, Associate Professor in the Master of Arts in Women's Society and Development program at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Professor Olwan's work is located at the nexus of feminist theorizations of gender violence, transnational solidarities, and critical feminist pedagogies. Her writing has appeared in Signs, Feminist Formations, the Journal of Settler Colonial Studies, American Quarterly, and Feral Feminisms.
Thank you so much for having me, Trish. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you, everyone. Thanks also to Georgetown Centers for International and Regional Studies, the CIRS, and many thanks also to Maram Al-Qudsi, who coordinated all this and helped me get online and all that. So I appreciate all the labor, visible and invisible, that has gone into making this happen. Thanks also to everyone for staying so late. I appreciate it. So I think what I wanted to do and what I discussed with Trish is perhaps making a few comments and then open it up for discussion and interaction with folks in attendance. And I think I'm going to try and organize my thoughts around 4 themes that I think emerge in the film, and I hope that we can address, and I will try and be concise and allow for further contributions from folks. So I think when I was watching the film, and I can barely do justice to its beauty, its complexity, and its many, if you wish, cinematic afterlives. It's a film that I don't think we can talk about in 30 minutes. I don't know how to talk about it in 30 minutes. I'm learning alongside all of you to talk about something of this magnitude and power. But the 4 ways that I thought I could perhaps think about it was around 4 different categories. And the first one is about thinking about the messiness and naughtiness of history, the entanglements, if you wish, that are happening in the text of the film, in the stories in the film. And there are many stories that are entangled with one another, and many histories, some of them present and some of them absent, some of them actually unfolding, and some of them taking place off screen and or happening in the future. So the first thought then is about this entanglement. And I think there are lots of entanglements. One is an entanglement between the history of modernity and the history of slavery. And another is an entanglement between the histories of modernities and slavery and the histories of settler coloniality. So how do we think about this film? How do we think about the site or the sites in this film without thinking and or reflecting on the entanglements of these histories? And these histories matter. They matter for the Peasant family in the story, in the film. It matters because the history here is not just a history, it's not a past, it's also a past, present, and a future. But they matter for Black life and Black livingness, if you wish to utilize Catherine McKittrick's, Black geographer Catherine McKittrick's terms, and I'll reference her quite a lot as I'm thinking about these naughty histories. The histories that are present, obviously, in the film, like to think about the film, we'd have to think about the year that it starts, which is 1902. The whole film unfolds, it begins and ends in one day, which is August 19th, 1902. And we are told from the very beginning that this is 50 years after the end of slavery. So these are the markers, these are the historical markers that the story tells us, that story uses to orient us. But the story doesn't just orient us, it actually disorients us, because it's not simply about 1902. It's not simply about August 19th. It's about so many histories. It's about the history of the Great Migration of African American survivors of slavery to the North. It's about the history of the transatlantic slavery. It's also about the history of saltwater slavery. It is a history of slavery, and it's also a history of resistance and a history of rebellion. Within these histories, there's also traces of 1492, the beginning of the genocide of indigenous people, the occupation, settler coloniality of North America, if you wish, but also traces of the loss of the Andalus, the fall of the Andalus, and the loss of the Muslim Empire. So all those histories are all tied in together in this story that actually is a lesson in the multiplicity of histories, but also the lesson in unhistory, if you wish. And by that, I mean, it is not a linear progressive account of history. It's actually a disorienting orientation of history. One of the ways in which Black geographer Catherine McKittrick talks about history and geography is she says, Black diasporic histories and geographies are difficult to track and cartographically difficult to imagine. And those two things are related and relevant when we think about this film. There are lots of tracks, there's a lot of traces, and we're not supposed to find one easy way to enter this narrative, not historically and not geographically. So then the first kind of question is this question of history or histories. The second is a question about the plantation and plantation geographies of displacement and emplacement. So how might we think about the space? How might we think about the space as in the space of the Tau Island, the Gula, the Sea Islands? How might we think about the sea? How might we think about the water? But how might we think about its relationship to land or lands, both lands that are actually imagined in the film, pictured in the film, and ones that are referenced in the film? So we might want to think about St. Simon Island. We might want to think about South Carolina. So we might want to think then about geographies of presence and absence. And some of these geographies are geographies of the future. So in the story, for example, we know that the Peasant family is moving. That is where the narrative takes us, where it leads us, or where it leaves us, if you wish. But we know also that they're not moving to one place. We know that they map multiple cartographies, multiple maps. So we know that Hagar and her sister Mayon, her daughter Mayon, are going to end up in Harlem, New York. We know that some people are going to end up in the main island. We know that Yellow Mary is going to end up in Halifax and Nova Scotia, and another settler colonial state. And we know from the geographies that they're mapping for us that these are not geographies of homes in a simple sense, but they're also geographies of homes and homelessness. They are geographies of intimacy. They are geographies of loss as well. One of the things that the film tells us again and again is this connection, this insistence on connection, the us here and the us across the seas, two people in one body, we are told. So there's this connection again between the people who are present in certain geographies and the people who are absent from them, and they're often invoked. So it is the history or the story and the geography of the peasant family, but it's also more than that. It is the story of the folks who died, the folks who were killed, the folks who were incarcerated, but also the folks who are yet to come. And that is where the story ends, the folks who are yet to come. And this is particularly important because the narrator of the story is in fact the unborn child. So that is something that we have to kind of think about, like who gets to tell what stories and who gets to imagine what geographies and what spaces and what places. Again, Catherine McKittrick says that Black sense of place is tied to fluctuating geographies and fluctuating historical contexts. And that seems to me to be really important lesson from this film. And I don't mean lesson in a didactic way, because there's nothing didactic about this film, but I mean that we need to kind of pay attention to this sense of fluctuation. There is no singular history, there is no singular story, but there is no singular geography either. So these are two main kind of themes. The third, and I think really important theme that we might want to attend to and discuss and talk about is this idea of intergenerational kinship and family making practices, or the insistence, again, to use Catherine McKittrick, on Black livingness. So the idea here is that there are lots of people, there's a lot of people who are living, and they're living very complex, very intricate, very intimate lives, and their lives are messy, and some of them are truncated by personal violence and collective violence, but their lives are not to be readily understood through heterosexual norms of kin making or family making. They far exceed them, they trouble them, they refuse them, and they refuse binaries of affiliation, binaries of familiality, binaries of love or kinship or kin making practice. In this film, Black women are not one, they don't experience the world in a singular way, their sexualities are not unified or straightly or contained singularly within a particular sexual binary. They actually far exceed them. And I think that that is a particularly important lesson or particular choice and particular kind of politics about Black family life and livingness that Dash makes repeatedly in this film. So one of the things that we see in this film, and I think like critics often pay attention to it, and I do think it's important, are the kin-making practices that occur towards the end of the film. So thinking about the possibilities of relationality between Indigenous people and Black people on the island and off the island. And that is certainly a really important kind of event or structure or relationship that unfolds in the film, and it is one that we have to think about and contend with. But there are other stories in the film that are also as relevant, if not also further complex. And one is the relationship between Eli and Ula, who Ula is raped. We don't know by whom for sure, although there is insinuation that she is raped by a white man, but that is never actually resolved. And while there is tension, there's insistence on accepting Ula and accepting the unborn child who will be born, who will carry the history and the memory of the family of the peasant. There's also the story of Yellow Mary, and Yellow Mary herself is a very uniquely complex character. Yellow Mary talks about independence, she talks about being ambitious, she talks about being and wanting to travel, but her sexuality is actually never fixed. She talks about perhaps wanting to have maybe married someone, not because she needed to marry a man, but maybe the possibility would have been interesting. But then there's also intimation in the story that she is actually with her lover. And what I find really particularly interesting towards the end of the film is when Ula insists that if you love yourselves, you must love Yellow Mary. She is part of you, just like we are part of our mothers. And that seems to be a really important lesson in kinship and really important lesson in the messiness of family, the knottiness of family. The fourth and final comment I'll make is regarding Indigenous and Black futures and afterlives. And I think that the film insists over and over again that while violence shapes Black life, violence does not end it. So the idea here is the insistence on the possibility of Black futures, a commitment, in fact, to Black futures, and the commitment to Black futures that is rooted in an awareness, an acute and deep awareness of the past, Black past, and its relationship and relevance to Black futurity. And there's a lot to say about that, because the film insists over and over again that Black future is a future of love, Black future is a future of kin-making, and Black future is a future of travel, and a Black future is a future of being homed, finding beauty in that which is ordinary, if you want to follow Saidiya Hartman's notion of ordinary and Black beauty. So in Black futures, we insist on birth and birthing, we insist on memory and memorialization, we insist on food and food-making practices. Pictures become necessary arrangements, they become ways in which Black futures are maintained and preserved, dreamed up. Black futures are also related to indigo practices that maybe originate in the plantation, but far exceeded. So indigo making becomes a Black future. It becomes a Black life-making practice. So these are just some of the thoughts that the film, leaves with me. And because we are in a series of events that insist on cinematic afterlives, I feel like it's really important to remember that the film itself has so many afterlives, right? And in form of a novel, in a form of documentary. It was released in 1991, then re-released 25 years later. But the film itself continues to have an afterlife of its own. So if you've seen Beyonce's Lemonade or Noel's work on popular Black culture, and we realize that this film far exceeds its cinematic beginning and has various quote unquote afterlives and or multiple endpoints. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had actually almost completely forgotten about Lemonade, and so I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's really just sort of a really powerful visual homage to this film. There are a lot of different places we can start, and I would really encourage folks to go ahead and put their questions into the Q&A. But just to sort of start off with, I would love to pick up on this point about indigo and its ties to futurity, because it's in the film, right? The only character who has a dress that's visibly been dyed with indigo is actually Nana Pizant. And so I was wondering if you could say a little more about sort of the futurity you see in indigo, where it comes through in the film for you.
I think that's super interesting. Somehow when I saw the film, it was tinted with blue all through cinematically. So the importance of indigo and blue, but also I remember there's a scene in which they're actually making, I think, building like stones that are actually dyed with the indigo. I don't know if you remember that scene, it's in the middle somewhere. So I think what I'm seeing in it is like this act of building, this act of remembering, this act of utilizing this thing that was basically learned in the plantation and using it, remaking it, resignifying it in the afterlives of slavery. So that was where I thought that the indigo mattered. And then I kind of just was thinking about, again, Catherine McKittrick with her essay on pastel blues, and Nina Simone. And I was thinking about the significance of both lemonade and blue for Black life, right? Like as symbols of Black life, Black nourishment, of sonic importance and political and historical significance. And obviously the socioeconomics of that. What does it mean to continue the practice of making, right? What was once owned by the plantation owners and making it your own and making it necessary for your own survival, making it part of what you make, No,
definitely. I think it really imbues that longer thread about the color itself with a real sense of materiality, which often I think, right, a lot of narratives about particularly slavery in North America really focus, either on cotton or tobacco, or and don't tend to focus as much on indigo, which was really sort of in the islands here. I think another really interesting question, back to your point about modernity, that really came through for me on this rewatching, is really also how powerfully religion is shaping the idea of what it means to be modern or not, or what it means to hold on to tradition. What do you think are some entry points we could maybe use to think more about sort of, this idea that we're generally thinking about tying it to culture or economy, and instead thinking it through religion, which is really how the Pesant family is thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you asked that. Like, I still don't know what to make of like the many religions that are in this film, right? So there's the African spirituality, there is obviously Christianity, which is in some point tied to progressiveness, right, to modernity, but then questioned as also violent, right, as something that will remove people ultimately from the island and from the practices that they have known. But I think another aspect is Islam. I mean, the film opens up with an adhan, with, a call to prayer, right? So what do we make of the character Bilal Muhammad? What do we make of the fact that he calls people to prayer? And repeatedly in the text, others are calling him a strange person, somewhat like, so there's tolerance and intolerance for his religiosity, right? And that seems to be the case with all three religions and how they're coexisting with one another or not coexisting with one another. So I think that the story is more complicated than like a story of like religion equals progressiveness, because in this, or religion equals civilization, because in this story, it's clear that it's not all religions, it's very clearly Christianity tied to the main island, tied to particular formations of coloniality, and also tied to very particular notions of Black progressiveness, right? So there's a lot going on there in terms of religion and who's able to stay with what religion and why not, right? Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's really striking too for Viola, right, that her insistence on sort of adopting this sort of Christianity of uplift, right, is so soul-rending for her. Whereas, the characters who are more connected to the island, who have a little bit more comfort with sort of the gray areas between the religions, tend to sort of handle it better, right? But sort of that rigidness of being all in one place or the other, being all one thing or the other, really just can't contain the complexity of their lives.
Yeah, and then the experiences of the folks continually exceed them, right? Like, what do we do with that final scene when they're kissing the book that Nana is carrying, right? Like, what do we do with that? Like, what is wrapped around the book, and what is the book, in fact? Like, so there's like a continual insistence on the existence of multiple religions within the multitudes of Black lives, right? And then there is a tension between those religions. In fact, when I was prepping for this talk, I read an interview with Dash, and Dash says that she insisted, she was very like determined in bringing Islam into the matter, because for her it was very important, because she's like, so much or so many Black films about Black experience ignore, right, the Islam, Black Islam, and she didn't want to do that, right? So I think we have to kind of think and contend with that. And then there's also like the indigenous spirituality. What do we do with the Cherokee Nation? What do we do with like, what, as the last survivor of the Cherokee Nation on the island, what religion does he follow, if any, right? Like, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of said and unsaid about religion and religiosity there.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions coming in from our group of attendees? I know it's not quite as engaging as we would normally like to have if we were all able to be in person, though hopefully we will be soon. And so this is a really interesting question, right? So how the film was received at the time of its release, though, even though I think, as you've pointed out, right, the idea of a release is not a singular event in the case of this film. And do you think it would be received differently in light of Black Lives Matter? And maybe as a friendly amendment, we could even say, right, how has, the sort of intellectual and cultural legacy of this film shaped Black Lives Matter, which I think we can really see in Lemonade, right, in sort of the way that she's entangling that sort of social movement, cultural narrative with the imagery from this film.
Well, it was interesting. So what I read was, so it's the first feature film, like debut, right? So it's part and parcel of a particular renaissance in a particular time of Black production, right? So it gets released in New York City, and it sells out for like 4 months, right? Like, they're sold out every weekend pretty much. So there's that. And then I was reading this article about how, like, from Hollywood, basically mainstream Hollywood, not a single reference, not a single like mention of this film. And I think like it's really important to think about this question of audience, like, who do we care about? This film mattered from the very moment it came about to the Black people who watched it, the Black people who filmed it, the Black people who created it and dreamed it, right? So I think like we need to think about multiplicity of audiences, but we need to center Black life and Black audience and Black viewership and Black politics, and thinking about the afterlives of these films. So I think the connection to Black Lives Matter is obviously important. And by the way, like in the link to Beyonce, she apparently also was asked, like, what do you make of that? And she's like, I love Beyonce, this is great. And like, I was very happy that this basically gave another life to the film, and also basically led to its re-release in 25 years later, right? And it was a really important release because basically they needed particular funding to maintain the quality of the images that they had taken. So there's like a lot to say about the afterlives of these films and the question of audience and politics of reception as well.
That's fantastic. We have time probably for one or two more questions. So if you want to go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I will go and I have a million things I could talk about with this film, like you said as well, right? I think the Beyonce thing, coming back to it again, and now I sort of wish that I had, gone back and rewatched that before we watched this film, is it's too late at night. I totally lost my train of thought right in the middle of that. But I guess it was going back to the McKittrick, right? So I actually have just been rereading Dear Science. And it strikes me that it's in some ways, it's a replica of her citational practice, right? Of sort of having the moving images that you could actually read Lemonade as a version of that. That's sort of, using this film as a point of departure, but also incorporating just a ton of other references and, sort of narratives in it as well.
Yeah, I really love what you just said about citational practices and like but also the citational practices in the film, right? Because it is like, I mean, you can't understand this film without doing research and understanding, like, what is it actually talking about? Where is it talking about? Who is it talking about, right? Like, so it requires certain kinds of, like an ethic of citation in order to understand really what the film is about. I think that's really beautiful, what you just said.
Well, and I think that actually gets to Zane's question in the chat, or comment rather, in the chat, really thinking about something we had discussed before about sort of where the film takes place and sort of the centrality of the land, the environment. And right, it's one point Nana Passant talks about, being so deeply tied to the soil. And then I guess, so maybe, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about the environmental aspect, and then I'll sort of work on bringing together these last couple of questions to finish this out.
Right, sorry, the question disappeared, I think. I was reading it and then...
So Zane had said, I would say the culture portrayed is beautiful, the color and the way the movie was filmed, and the very mesmerizing. I like the environment and the culture of the movie, like the sand, the water, soil, trees, the clothes, food, etc.
So your question is like, how do we kind of like reckon with this environment, right? Like, how do we think about it? And I think like one of the ways in which, again, like the afterlives of this film force us or compel us or invite us to kind of think about it is in relation to the South, right? In relation also to, geographies of islands, geographies of water, right? And relationships between lands and waters and lives suspended in between. And I think that like every single like scene in this film can be a picture, right? And it's intended that way. And she talks very, like the director Dash speaks very directly about this, the purposeful choices she made and how this was about, the colors that she had grown up with, the waters that she had known. And she also talks about the fact that like when they were filming, they had to be careful about the sunset and sunrise and the water coming in and the water going out. So they had to like attend to all those questions. And you can kind of see that in the scenery, right?
So we have 4 questions that have come in. I think maybe so we get a chance to discuss them both fully. We can maybe take them in pairs because they sort of relate to each other in that sense. So two of them relate to sort of thinking about Bilal as a character. And so one is sort of thinking about more broadly the treatment and place of Black people within Islam. And the other is really thinking about the way he signals at sort of this broader Black Atlantic, right? As someone who has traveled, between the French West Indies, has ended up in the Sea Islands, is considered, he's several times referred to as a saltwater African, but in his own narration, he didn't actually emphasize that quite as much, right? He starts with the ship, which is a really unique way, right, for that narrative to start, given how narratives usually unfold. But so, he has this sort of multilinguistic existence. And so if you have thoughts on sort of recasting this period of Black experiences, the meeting of multiple histories and cultures, instead of how it's often written about as literally Black and white.
Right. Well, I think that and I see the next question. I see three questions. So the two questions that relate to Bilal. So I'll just try and bring them together in some way. So one, Bilal is obviously like reckoning a memory, harkening back to Bilal, the first Black mu'adhin in Islam. So that is super significant. His naming is like very significant. Anyone who's aware of Muslim history knows what they're also saying. The importance of this is that it's a reference to, in Muslim historiographies, of like Black inclusion, Black embrace of Islam, right? So that is important, and it's a combination of Bilal and Muhammad, the name of the prophet, right? So the question about, does this speak to the treatment of Black people within Islam, particularly given he was viewed as weird and odd in the character? I don't know, but I think that what it does invite us to think about is histories of Black Islam, right? And to think about them in relation to the transatlantic slave trade, and also beyond that, to think about those histories and to think about Islam in America as constitutive to the legacies of slavery, right? To understand Islam not as an importation, but as something that's actually has been there from the very beginnings of slavery, right? So I don't know if that answers it, but I think that that is important, that the film consistently refuses, I think, a singular Black history or historiography. It actually emphasizes again and again multiple Black histories, right? And they're not all reconciled in a neat way. And I think that's what's really beautiful about this film, that she refuses to impose linearity or order. In fact, there's disorder, there's discomfort, and there's, moving away from certain kinds of religious practices, right? And there's also a hierarchy of spirituality that's happening here. So I don't know if that addresses the question. But I see also there's a question regarding violence, and I think that's super important. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, Trish, and I can also speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the question here that we have is that saying that the film is visually stunning, while at the same time we see how this landscape is laden with multiple and interconnected violences and histories that the film evokes, but not always spells out in forms as in other forms of cinematic representation. How does this film help us revisit questions of representing violent histories? I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways we could get at this question, because I think one of the really key things is that the majority of the violence happens off screen, right? And so it's sort of, McKittrick is sort of the person who's here without being here, right? But the sort of narrating violence without describing it, right? And sort of by allowing sort of Black subjectivity to really be at the center of how that's narrated, putting livingness at the center of it, rather than letting the violence become the sum total of the act.
Yeah, I was thinking the same exact thing. Like the rape, we never see, we never know, it's never resolved. You don't even know who is the rapist. He's not the center of the story, right? But the history of slavery is there, right? Like the violence of it, but it's not the end all of Black life, right? So again, I think McKittrick, but also Saidiya Hartman, right? Like how do we think about the history of Black livingness beyond reducing it to violence, right? Like how do we think about it while attending to the magnitude of violences, but not reducing Black life to the moment of death, right? Like how do we imagine, how do we think about Black life? How do we insist on Black futurity, right? And I do think that question is like super important and necessary, because I think that the film refuses to contend with violence as the only present or violence as the as just an interruption of life or an end of life, right? So violence is posed as both possibility and impossibility, but it's not there for us to consume. It's not there for us to, it's not there for us to be repulsed by, enjoy, feast, and or resist, right? It's there, but it's not the end all or be all of Black experience and Black life.
And I think that's why it's so important too that you brought Hartman into the conversation. Because I think another way of seeing, the balance between, I really love the way that you put it, between the present and absent histories, is really being another way of talking about her, the being respectful of what you cannot know. And so I think, when, particularly as a historian encountering her writing on that, right, the first thing you cannot know is that the records do not exist to accurately tell, but also cannot know in terms of not your story to have or to hold. And I think that the film plays really powerfully with that here.
Yeah, and as I also enter into the story with trepidation and humility, knowing that there is so much I do not know, right, about Black life, about Black experience, and cannot know, right, as a non-Black person. So I think that there's that like this idea, like the violence is not there for us to consume, because we are not there to know, and we're not there to measure, and we're not there to utilize Black pain for a calculus of life that renders Blackness absent, to utilize, again, McKittrick and Hartman. You're right, McKittrick is everywhere tonight. So, yeah.
I know, just for serendipity, I was actually reading this with another colleague just earlier today. So I think, the other thing that this film, a lot of the imagery really calls out to our next film, which we're going to be watching, I think, in 2 weeks, Sankofa. And so the similarity of the ties back to Africa and what it means to have a relationship with the people across the water. And so that's sort of just sort of a holding place for us for the next sort of sequence part of the series. But I guess, as we wrap up for the night, do you want to sort of give a last couple of thoughts? I'll give you the last word.
Oh my God. No, I just feel like really honored and humbled to be part of this and have the ability to think with you and alongside all of you about this film, which I think is it's something I'm gonna have to continue to think about and talk about. I don't know. I'm still like haunted by the last words, I think, of the unborn child, right? Who again reminds us towards the end that she's there and the land continues and the stories continue, and that memory is not memory that is known always to us, that is told to us, but it is one that is kind of learned. So the kind of like importance of memory and the politics of memorialization, so I don't know, there's just so much to kind of uncover and think about, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have watched it with you all and got to think about it and be left with questions and unknowns.
I actually always tell my students that when we do history the right way, we end up with a better version of the question we started with rather than the answer usually. So I think that's a really wonderful way to leave it for tonight. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to see all of you at future events. Please come and be a regular part of the series. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.